On September 30th, 2022, a profound shift occurred in the heart of West Africa, marking the precise moment a young military captain named Ibrahim Traoré took the helm of a nation that the Western establishment had comfortably dismissed as a failed state. For decades, the global narrative, heavily engineered by Paris and echoed through the corridors of Washington and London, insisted that true, self-sustaining infrastructural development in the Sahel was nothing more than an impossible dream. The script written for Burkina Faso was meant to be a permanent tragedy of dependency. The assumption was deeply embedded in the mechanics of neocolonialism. It was deemed fundamentally impossible for a landlocked African nation to pave its own roads, power its own villages, or build its own hospitals without the heavy, conditional hand of Western loans, the restrictive oversight of the International Monetary Fund, and the patronizing guidance of foreign contractors. They sought to convince a proud people that they could not possibly survive, let alone build a future, without the permission and the pocketbook of their former colonial masters. But a revealing moment is currently unfolding across the red soil of Burkina Faso. The true revolution, spearheaded by Ibrahim Traoré and the alliance of Sahel states, is not merely playing out on the battlefield with rifles, tactical maneuvers, and the expulsion of foreign military bases. While the defense of their sovereign territory is paramount, there is a second, quieter, yet equally formidable war being waged. It is a relentless, methodical resistance fought with freshly laid asphalt, roaring bulldozers, state-owned excavators, and multi-million-dollar national projects funded entirely by the sovereign wealth of the Burkinabe people. They are not simply fighting back against armed insurgency. They are actively constructing the very sovereign reality that the West declared unattainable. They are turning the colonial impossibilities into tangible, breathing monuments of black self-determination. To truly comprehend the magnitude of what Ibrahim Traoré has initiated in a mere 44 months, we must first look unflinchingly at the broken foundation he inherited. We must examine the brutal legacy of what 60 years of paper independence under the shadow of French neo-colonialism actually produced. From the moment the French flag was lowered in 1960 to the autumn of 2022, the systemic underdevelopment of Burkina Faso was not an accident. It was a highly effective economic strategy. In over 6 decades, a nation of more than 20 million people, spanning a vast and resource-rich territory, managed to construct barely 4,000 kilometers of paved roads out of a national network exceeding 15,000 kilometers. Even by the most generous estimates of the African Development Bank, less than 27% of the country's roads were paved, and of that tiny fraction, less than a third were in acceptable condition. This catastrophic failure of infrastructure was the deliberate outcome of the CFA franc system and decades of foreign-led development programs that consistently prioritized the salaries of European consultants over the pouring of concrete. But these statistics, as damning as they are, do not capture the true human cost. To understand the depth of this structural violence, you must look into the tired eyes of the older generation. Picture the elderly market women of Ouagadougou or Bobo Dioulasso, women whose resilience has been the unacknowledged spine of the nation's economy. For her entire adult life, a mother or grandmother waking up hours before dawn in a rural village, has had to subject her body to a perilous, exhausting journey just to sell her harvest. Loading her meticulously grown produce onto a fragile cart or a precarious bush taxi, she faces a road network that actively works against her survival. During the relentless dry season, these unpaved dirt arteries transform into choking corridors of thick red dust that coats her lungs and her goods. When the heavy rains finally come, these exact same roads dissolve into impassable, treacherous rivers of thick mud, swallowing vehicles whole and cutting off entire communities from the outside world. Her physical exhaustion, the chronic pain in her joints from decades of brutal travel, and the devastating financial loss when her fresh vegetables rot in a stalled truck miles from the market. These are not natural disasters. They are the direct, calculated consequences of an infrastructural starvation imposed by a global system that views African labor as expendable and African comfort as unnecessary. This lack of mobility was designed to keep the population strictly in survival mode, severely limiting their economic upward mobility and preventing the unification of the domestic market. This was the desolate floor. This was the bleak, dusty starting line that the international press sneered at, labeling Burkina Faso a country that existed only on a map, but not in functional reality. It was a nation violently stripped of its dignity, watching its raw wealth leave its borders while its own people walked on broken earth. When Ibrahim Traoré stepped into leadership, he did not just inherit a political crisis. He inherited an infrastructural graveyard deliberately left behind by the very powers that claimed to be helping. And it was from the center of this profound neglect that Traoré decided the era of waiting for foreign salvation was permanently over. The eternal question posed by cynics, foreign observers, and international economists alike is a profoundly practical one. How does a nation, perpetually ranked near the very bottom of the Global Human Development Index and actively fighting a grueling internal insurgency, suddenly discover hundreds of millions of dollars to fund a nationwide infrastructural renaissance? The answer lies not in the conditional charity of foreign aid, nor in the predatory lending of international banks, but deep beneath the red soil of the Sahel itself. The answer is found in the rigid, unapologetic enforcement of what we must recognize as the resource doctrine. For generations, Burkina Faso has been sitting on immense geological wealth, recognized globally as one of Africa's premier and most lucrative gold producers. Yet, for decades, that glittering fact meant absolutely nothing to the ordinary Burkinabe citizen. It was a cruel, engineered paradox where the immense wealth of the land directly contradicted the crushing poverty of its people. The industrial mining sector was overwhelmingly dominated by foreign multinational corporations, heavily headquartered in the distant air-conditioned financial districts of Toronto, London, and Perth. They arrived, they extracted, and they exported. The gold was pulled from African earth by African hands, but the staggering financial profits evaporated overseas, leaving behind ecologically scarred landscapes and deeply impoverished local communities who received only the meager, dust-covered crumbs of their own rightful inheritance. To truly grasp the tragedy of this systemic extraction, you must look away from the corporate balance sheets and look down into the shadowed, suffocating trenches of the artisanal mines. Consider the daily reality of a young Burkinabe man, perhaps 25 years old, whose formal education was cut brutally short by economic necessity. Every day, beneath a punishing, relentless Sahelian sun, he descends into a precarious, hand-dug, unreinforced pit that threatens to collapse at any moment. The air he breathes is thick with silica dust, and his hands are permanently scarred and hardened by the brutal physical labor of breaking solid rock. For years, his sweat, his exhaustion, and his immense physical risk did not build schools or pave roads for his community. Instead, he was trapped at the very bottom of an exploitative, global supply chain. His hard-won grams of raw gold were purchased for a mere fraction of their true worth, feeding a vast, illicit shadow economy that funneled the wealth across porous borders to international smuggling networks. He was risking his life on a daily basis, not for the sovereign future of his beloved nation, but merely to survive another week, a forgotten pawn in a global system of unchecked neo-colonial extraction. This was the deeply entrenched, highly exploitative architecture that Captain Ibrahim Traoré inherited, and it is precisely the system he has aggressively moved to dismantle. Recognizing the fundamental truth that political sovereignty is nothing but an illusion if a nation does not control its own physical wealth, the government initiated a profound restructuring of the mining sector. In a revealing moment for the global commodities market, the perception changed sharply as Burkina Faso decisively rewrote its mining codes, significantly raising the state's mandatory interest in all major mining projects. They established a national mining development fund designed specifically to channel capital directly back into the rural communities living near the extraction sites. Through deliberate, unwavering state action, by the end of 2025, 6 of the country's 15 major industrial gold mines were transitioned into the majority ownership of Burkinabe entities. But extracting the gold was only half the battle. The historical trap of the African continent has always been the export of raw materials for others to process and profit from. To break this cycle of dependency, Traoré launched the country's first national gold refinery. As he stated with unmistakable clarity and defiance, "We will extract our gold ourselves." The impact of this policy shift was immediate and staggering. In 2025, Burkina Faso produced an unprecedented 94 tons of gold, the highest annual output in its entire recorded history. Crucially, 42 of those tons were legally and formally sourced from the very artisanal miners who previously fed the smuggling rings. That young man in the dusty pit is no longer exploited by shadowy middlemen. He has been organized into a formal state-protected cooperative. His grueling labor now directly feeds his nation's treasury. The gold stays home, and the capital it generates forms the unbreakable financial spine of the nation's new infrastructure. And what exactly is being built with this newly reclaimed sovereign wealth? This brings us to the shattered illusions of Western developmental models. The traditional neo-colonial method for building an African road is a well-documented, meticulously designed trap. An African government must borrow heavily from a Western or international financial institution, accepting stringent structural adjustment conditions, only to immediately hand that borrowed money over to a foreign engineering firm. The firm utilizes imported foreign equipment and highly paid foreign consultants, billing the nation at heavily inflated prices. The inevitable result is a perpetual cycle of crippling national debt and a deeply compromised sovereignty. Ibrahim Traoré fundamentally rejected this predatory cyclical trap through a sweeping presidential initiative known as Faso Mobile, a powerful, resonant call to action derived from the native Moor and Dioula languages, translating simply and profoundly to, "Let's build the nation." The philosophy behind Faso Mobile is brilliantly straightforward. Remove the parasitic middlemen and empower the people. Instead of hiring bloated international contractors, the state utilized its own funds to purchase and import hundreds of units of heavy machinery, bulldozers, massive excavators, and heavy-duty dump trucks. Traoré personally handed this formidable equipment over not to private corporations, but to national engineering brigades, operated entirely by Burkinabe citizens who are being rigorously trained on the job. The economic logic is bulletproof. When a project is finished, the massive capital outlay, the heavy machinery, and the vital engineering skills do not fly back to Paris or Beijing. They remain firmly rooted in Ouagadougou, fully prepared for the next project and the one after that. The undisputed crown jewel of this sovereign infrastructural initiative is the Ouagadougou to Bobo-Dioulasso expressway. Breaking ground in late 2025, this is not merely a stretch of asphalt. It is a 332-kilometer multi-lane artery of economic life, connecting the country's two largest economic hubs. But the physical road itself is not the true headline. The financing is the real revolution. This massive undertaking requires nearly 200 billion CFA francs, roughly equivalent to 357 million US dollars. It was fully and proudly written into Burkina Faso's own 2026 national budget. There is no World Bank loan attached to it. There is no crippling Eurobond hanging over the heads of the next generation. It is funded entirely by the reclaimed gold of their own soil and the patriotic direct financial contributions of Burkinabe citizens and the diaspora. For a landlocked, heavily sanctioned country to independently finance a civil engineering project of this magnitude is a serious diplomatic shock to the international institutions that have long dictated Africa's financial boundaries. It represents a damaging embarrassment to the former colonial powers who aggressively insisted that such self-reliance was structurally impossible. By building this vital expressway with their own sovereign money and their own capable hands, the people of Burkina Faso are doing far more than facilitating regional trade. They are pouring the indestructible concrete foundation of absolute, undeniable economic independence. To fully comprehend the depth of this sovereign awakening, we must look beyond the macroeconomic indicators and the massive ribbons of asphalt. We must recognize that true national infrastructure is not merely a collection of concrete, steel, and government contracts. It is the fundamental architecture of human dignity. It is the very foundation of life. Under neo-colonial governance, infrastructure was designed to extract wealth. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, infrastructure is being meticulously designed to sustain and elevate the Burkinabe people. Nowhere is this paradigm shift more visible than in the very soil of the nation. For decades, the global agricultural system imposed a devastating paradox upon Burkina Faso, a country where 8 out of 10 citizens are intimately tied to the land, working tirelessly as farmers, was systematically forced to import more than 200,000 tons of rice every single year just to survive. They were pushed into growing cash crops for European markets, while their own children went hungry. Traoré recognized this as a profound national security threat. Echoing the immortal, self-reliant spirit of Thomas Sankara, the government launched a massive, state-backed agricultural offensive. In 2025 alone, the state injected roughly $179 million into agricultural mechanization. Instead of importing foreign food, they are importing the means of production, deploying over 600 heavy tractors and more than 1,000 tillers directly to the farming cooperatives. Picture the seasoned, elderly farmer who has spent 50 years breaking his back with a hand hoe, watching a state-provided tractor tear through the heavy Sahelian earth for the very first time. That machine represents more than agricultural efficiency. It represents the emancipation of his physical body and the sudden, breathtaking realization that his government finally views his labor as the bedrock of the nation. This restoration of dignity extends from the sunlit fields directly into the darkest hours of the night. In the year 2025 alone, the government successfully connected roughly 160,000 households to the national electrical grid. 131 rural villages, communities that had existed in complete, unbroken darkness since the dawn of time, suddenly witnessed the profound miracle of electric light. More than 25,000 new streetlights now illuminate the outskirts of major cities and provincial towns. In the comfortable, developed enclaves of the West, a streetlight is entirely mundane. But in a nation actively fighting a brutal insurgency, light is a visceral, visible form of security. A streetlight means the local market does not have to shudder in fear when the sun goes down. It means a mother can walk home safely with her children, no longer terrified of the shadows. It means the economic lifeblood of the community can continue to pulse long after dusk. Light is the physical manifestation of a state reclaiming its territory from fear. Yet, perhaps the most profoundly emotional testament to this sovereign build-out lies within the realm of public health. In December of 2025, Traoré inaugurated the Pala University Hospital in Bobo Dioulasso. This is not a modest rural clinic. It is a sprawling 500-bed medical complex covering 42,000 square meters. Inside this facility stands the first interventional brain and cardiovascular imaging suite in the entire sub-region, accompanied by a state-of-the-art radiotherapy center. Consider the profound, life-altering weight of that single medical center. For generations, an elderly Burkinabe mother or grandmother, diagnosed with cancer, faced an unimaginably cruel reality. Her diagnosis was essentially a deferred death sentence. Her only options were to desperately liquidate everything her family owned to afford a medical evacuation to Morocco, Tunisia, or Europe, a financial impossibility for the vast majority, or to simply go home, sit in the agonizing heat, and quietly wait for the inevitable. The international community considered her life an acceptable casualty of an underdeveloped system. Today, that same mother can walk through the doors of a hospital built on Burkinabe soil. She can receive life-saving radiation therapy while surrounded by her children, speaking her own language, anchored in her own culture. This is not just a triumph of medical engineering. It is a reclamation of human rights. It is the definitive proof that the lives of African elders hold inherent, immeasurable value. This brings us to a crucial, often misunderstood reality of the geopolitics of the Sahel. The massive development initiatives orchestrated by Ibrahim Traoré are not a distraction from the war against terrorism. They are the most devastating weapon in his arsenal. The insurgency that has plagued Burkina Faso relies entirely on despair, poverty, and the total absence of state support to recruit alienated young men. When a government actively builds roads, provides steady employment, electrifies villages, and delivers tractors to farmers, it aggressively starves the terrorist networks of their most vital resource: human hopelessness. The results of this dual strategy of military force and sovereign development are impossible to ignore. From a devastating peak of over 2 million internally displaced persons in 2023, the government now reports that more than 1 million Burkinabe have safely returned home. 1 million people have packed up their makeshift lives in refugee camps and walked back to their ancestral lands, reopening schools that were shuttered by violence and replanting fields that had turned to dust. That mass migration back to the villages is a serious diplomatic shock to the Western analysts who confidently predicted the total collapse of the state. This is not to suggest that the road ahead is paved in unblemished gold. The leadership of Burkina Faso operates with clear-eyed realism. The security situation, while vastly improved, remains a highly contested variable, with certain rural pockets still vulnerable to tragic sudden violence. The ambitious Donson International Airport project has faced construction delays, drawing predictable, pointed criticism from the International Monetary Fund regarding weak coordination. Furthermore, funding this sovereign renaissance relies heavily on the international price of gold, a volatile commodity that currently accounts for roughly 70% of the nation's exports. A sudden plunge in global gold prices could significantly tighten the concrete flow of these monumental projects. But it is precisely because these immense challenges exist that the path chosen by Traoré and the alliance of Sahel states is so historically significant. They are fully aware of the risks, yet they have made a profound philosophical choice. They have fundamentally decided that it is far better to build their nation slowly, meticulously, and occasionally with delays, using their own sovereign wealth and their own sweat, than to build it rapidly using the poisoned, conditional loans of the International Monetary Fund. They have chosen the difficult, arduous path of true independence over the comfortable, heavily subsidized illusion of neo-colonial servitude. To understand the profound historical weight of what is currently unfolding under Ibrahim Traoré, we must look backward to a dream that was violently interrupted. Nearly 4 decades ago, a visionary leader named Thomas Sankara stood before the world and dared to articulate a radically different future for his people. He envisioned a Burkina Faso, the land of upright people, that fed itself, clothed itself, and governed itself without bowing to the exploitative demands of Paris or the conditional charity of international financial institutions. Sankara's vision was so dangerous to the established global order that it cost him his life. For years, the Western establishment operated under the comfortable assumption that when Sankara fell, his dream of absolute black self-determination was permanently buried with him beneath the dry Sahelian earth. They were fundamentally mistaken. They buried a man, but they inadvertently planted a resilient, indestructible seed. Today, Captain Ibrahim Traoré is not simply echoing Sankara's rhetoric. He is systematically pouring the concrete foundation of that exact unfinished dream. The true measurement of this sovereign revival is not found in the sterile statistics of rising GDP, nor is it found solely in the soaring global market price of refined gold. The ultimate metric of this nation's success is found in the weary, yet profoundly hopeful footsteps of 1 million human beings. Consider the sheer staggering magnitude of that reality. 1 million internally displaced Burkinabe citizens, people who had lost absolutely everything, who spent years languishing in crowded, desperate refugee camps, entirely dependent on the meager rations of international aid organizations, are finally going home. Picture the older patriarch of a displaced family, his hands worn and his spirit severely tested by years of enforced exile. Today, he is packing up his modest belongings. He is walking back down a newly secured road, returning to the very land his ancestors cultivated for centuries. He is stepping back into a village that now has electric light piercing the night, where state-provided tractors are actively preparing the soil, and where his grandchildren can safely return to a newly reopened school. This massive, quiet migration of 1 million souls returning to their roots is not just a logistical triumph. It is the ultimate restoration of human dignity. It is a powerful, undeniable declaration that the state has returned to protect its people. What Burkina Faso is currently achieving serves as a beacon for the entire African continent and the global Black diaspora. They are proving, brick by sovereign brick, that a landlocked, heavily pressured African nation can reclaim its wealth, reject neo-colonial financial traps, and build an infrastructure that serves the poorest among its citizens first. They are demonstrating that true sovereignty is not an outdated romantic concept. It is a highly practical, functioning reality that can be achieved when a leadership genuinely aligns with the survival and prosperity of its people. The impossible was simply a lie designed to keep a continent on its knees, And the Burkinabe people are currently dismantling that lie with every mile of road they pave. As we continue to watch the alliance of Sahel states rise and actively redefine the geopolitical map of West Africa, we must ask ourselves what part we play in acknowledging this truth. If you find value in these authentic stories of African resilience, if you believe in documenting the genuine rise of modern Africa beyond the biased, deeply flawed filters of Western media, I invite you to join our community here at Bright Africa. Subscribe to the channel, share this profound history with your family and your elders, and stand with us as we continue to witness a proud people confidently building their own sovereign future.